So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my former colleagues, Naveh Greenberg and David Turner, who are going to talk a little bit about planning and plan to plan early for conversion. And I just want to say one thing. It's amazing that organizations get their information model done, but they haven't gathered all their content yet. So when it's time to convert, they're running around finding their content. You would have thought that they would have found it a lot earlier because it really influenced the information model. And that goes back to some of the things that Sabina said early in the process, having that content inventory. Anyway, Naveh and David from DCL. Naveh's been a senior product manager at DITA, an S1000D expert. He's sells into the military and government and manufacturing and technology space. And David goes back a ways in DITA prior to DCL. I'll be quiet now and let you finish introducing yourselves and get through your presentation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Brian. I appreciate it, and thanks everybody for sticking with us here today, sticking around here for the end of this. I'm excited to get to present and to have my colleague Naveh and all of his 20+ years of experience in leading these content conversion projects. So let's just get this thing kicked off. Just quickly here, I know a lot of you have dealt with the same things that I've dealt with here in these last few years, or last few months, and that's the pandemic. And we all did a little binge watching, I think, didn't we? And one of the shows that I fell in love with during this pandemic was Nailed It. And I don't know if anybody's ever watched that. If you've watched Nailed It, if you love Nailed It, put something in the chat. Let us know that you love it, or you watched it, or you hate it, or whatever. But if you're not familiar with it, what happens is guests come on this show, and they have the opportunity to try to recreate some sort of a baked good, cake, cookies, something that was done by a professional, and they've got kind of a limited time to do it. And the results are a little bit funny sometimes, because when you're working with like a cramped amount of time, and it's something you haven't done before, sometimes it's really a lot harder than it looks. And this does actually tie into what we're talking about here today, because I think sometimes content conversion can be the same way. If you've ever tried to just do a simple PDF to Word conversion, using the little automated tool that they've got, that it only takes a few seconds. I did one just not too long ago, and it took me about 2 minutes or something to convert this document, even though it was 113 pages. But what I discovered is that there was still just a ton of cleanup that was involved, and this was a pretty simple, straightforward document. This Adobe to Word type of basic conversion is one of those things that it'll get maybe some of the headings right, but it also does a lot of weird translations that you might not expect. And I think, for example, one of the first things that I noticed here is we see a table here, and this table continues down here, right? So it's all one table. Well, this conversion doesn't know it. You may or may not be able to tell, but this has created this one as a table, and then it starts this other part as a completely separate table, which obviously that's going to break the document if you try to render it in some other way or something like that. So, the thing is that these kinds of conversions are, they do typically involve a lot of conversion, a lot of cleanup, and they do typically involve a lot of effort. All right, I'm going to let Naveh talk here in just a second here. Let's talk a little bit about some of the different approaches that we've seen to conversion. There's kind of a common perception that at one end you can start out with maybe trying to do this yourself by writing a script. We've heard a lot of people say this. Yeah, this is going to be a simple mapping. We're just going to do it ourselves. We've got really smart IT people, and they kind of have this idea that yeah, we'll have to do some cleanup. But, it's going to be pretty cheap and easy. Moving up the scale a little bit, you've got kind of the off-the-shelf softwares. Let's go out and let's buy this tool that's going to help us to convert this. And yeah, we should be able to move ahead. Or Some others will say, well, maybe I don't want to do that, but you know what, I'm just going to pay kind of a low cost vendor, somebody who can just, kind of quickly do this for us. And then at the other end, you've got your full service vendor. And so the perception is that at one end, yeah, there's a little bit more cleanup involved, but it's a lot, it's a lower cost. At the other end, you've got a little bit less cleanup involved, but it's a higher cost. So my first question for you here in this session today is, how accurate do you think these different perceptions are?
So the perceptions are often not correct. I think the problem is that when you select one of the three, you think that you are in control because you're doing all the work, or you're paying a low rate for commercial software, or you think you're getting a great deal from a discounted vendor. But at least the first three approaches, there's really no analysis or no prepping of the material, and most importantly, no QA. And really, these models force you to do all the work, and it's a lot of work, go through a very steep learning curve, and still require a lot of cleanup. The cost of a do-it-yourself solution or a discounted vendor may seem initially less expensive than a full service model, but very often that's not the case. The full service model, saves you a lot of headaches, a lot of risks, and a higher cost of dealing with unexpected surprises. What really drives up the cost of any conversion project is the complexity of the content, the lack of good planning, and understanding what can go wrong before it actually happens, and planning for it. If you do have a very simple content and very simple output, the first three approaches may make sense to you, but usually these approaches are for people that are not looking for DITA. For DITA, for people who go for DITA, you really need to think about a full service where you can get on-time deliveries, consistent output, high-quality content, and guarantee results. And all of that require a lot of planning.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing you say here is, if I'm maybe like a trade books publisher, and I've got like this fiction book and it's all text, and I really just have kind of one output type, maybe it's going to print, writing a script could feasibly make sense because we're just mapping a few things. But when we start to get into things like conditional content, footnotes, citations, complex tables, lots of lists and bullets that might look different in different places, reuse, it really starts to make that automated approach, or even using the discount vendor approach, not very feasible. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Well, hey, just for fun, then let's go over and let's talk about some epic failures. Can you give us any examples of some customers or potential customers that you talk to, where a little planning on the front end, a little understanding of the complexities of their content, and then planning for some of these things might have saved a ton of headache for them?
Yeah. So I don't know if it's for fun, but I do have two examples. One of them was a conversion from a structured data, HTML in this case, to XML. And initially the client thought that it should be an easy task because it's going from a structured data into a structured data as well. But
structured to structured should be a pretty easy map, right? Yeah.
Correct. So that's the initial thinking, which leads to a lot of problems. And actually, at the beginning, according to the client, everything appeared to be on target and within budget, and they did a quick review and didn't see any data loss. But when they started importing the data to a CMS and attempted to publish it, they actually found a lot of problems. The biggest problem was that a lot of data was missing, and something that something as simple as in the legacy data, there were a lot of elements that triggered the style sheet, the legacy style sheet, to auto-generate text. So, for example, the element task will will trigger the style sheet to produce the word task, and then another attribute will let it know is it a troubleshooting task, a maintenance task, or a QA task. And when converting to DITA, they automatically mapped everything to a task, which makes sense. But when publishing, all that data was lost. So it's something that you don't think up front, but when you do find out, it's really late in the game. But another issue was that the legacy data itself had some issues with table tagging, cross-references, paragraph labels that were hard-coded in the HTML. So you had, let's say, para 1 do this, para 2 do that, and instead of mapping it to a step, it remained as a paragraph, but it was not sort of everything got carried over to DITA, and it took them months to fix these issues, and you can only imagine the time and cost it would have saved them if they did proper planning at the beginning and looked into these issues.
Yeah, and you think they could have discovered these issues and really saved all this at the beginning as well?
Correct. And I think I'm going to cover it a little bit later about checking your legacy data, but I have another example because you touched PDF before, and we had another client that had to convert PDF to DITA, and the process was they took the PDF, they exported it to Word, and then they used an automated software that they developed. And they actually selected few manuals that they will convert, and after they're converted, they will do a detailed review, which up to now is actually good practice. But when they started reviewing the data, they noticed that special characters were dropped, paragraphs were combined, tables were not properly tagged, incorrect hierarchy of paragraphs. All of that you covered actually in your example, because when you export PDF to Word, you always have actually known issues that if you would have handled it up front, you wouldn't get to that problem when you start reviewing the data. But a bigger problem was that when they worked on the quick and very unprofessional analysis, they made a rule that every time they see the keyword figure or table, they'll insert cross-reference, which does make sense. But there were a lot of cases where, if it tagged to a figure, it will go to the incorrect figure or table. For example, it will say, refer to figure 1 in chapter 2. So it will refer to figure 1, but not in chapter 2 in the existing chapter. Or refer to the figure 3 in the next chapter. So as you can see, anything that was captured as a cross-reference was cross-referenced, but not to the correct location. But another problem was that because they only took into account keyword figure, they missed all the different variation, like fig, F-I-G, period, illustration, figure with a dash in between one of the letters, because a known problem with PDF, when you save it, it sometimes carry over the dashes. So all of this missed cross-reference was done as regular text. And going back and fixing all of that was a major undertaking for them. And again, with simple analysis of the legacy data and known issues of PDF, with text extraction with PDF, and documenting all the conversion rules, that would have saved them all this time and aggravation.
And, one example I was thinking of, I talked to somebody at a conference not too long ago who had done a conversion of their content to DITA, and they'd done this conversion 2 years ago. And I said, well, really, how's it going? And they said, well, we're really not getting to use our CCMS or any of this system yet. And I said, well, it's been 2 years. What's going on? And they said, well, it's we didn't really plan for the reuse piece of it, and we didn't really plan for this cleanup. So we've been really just cleaning up our content for the last 2 years, and we're hoping that here in the next year or so we might be able to start working. And to me, that's just that's a recipe for disaster, because a recipe, you like that, no pun intended, because when you do one of these projects, you already face pushback from writers, right? Having to do something new or not be able to do something they were going to do before, and so they're already kind of negative. And if you then couple with that, you actually don't get to use the system. You're going to be spending your time, cleaning up content for the next several months. They're going to fight you the whole way. So to me, a little bit of planning on the front end, looking at the reuse, looking at the cleanup, thinking about those things on the front end would have saved them a ton of time and gotten the writers writing. So anyway, let's take it from here, and I want to just talk about some of the common misconceptions. You and I both, in working with the customers that we talk to, we hear comments all the time, and I thought it would just give you a chance to kind of address some of these. So one really common one is, my data is all over the place. So you talk about automation, but there's really no way to automate anything. How would you respond?
So there are actually quite a few ways to normalize the data, and it can be done by running preliminary audit on the data, and we're going to cover exactly what that means later on. But finding sort of ways to deal with all the anomalies and inconsistency of the data. If you develop a detailed conversion rules that cover as many variations as possible up front, that will take away the headaches of dealing with what we discussed previously in the three examples that we gave before.
Yeah.
But there's a way to apply styles and pre-edit tags that will allow the conversion software to be more effective. And actually, it surprises a lot of people when they find out what we can do with the data they initially considered as not suitable for conversion. But really, a lot of it is achieved simply by planning, by analyzing the data, documenting the rules. And the more time you invest up front, the easier the conversion is, and much less cleanup after the fact, if any.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, Brian has always been fond of saying, there's always going to be cleanup. There's going to be some cleanup beforehand. There's going to be some cleanup afterwards. But it's how you plan for this and how you analyze it gives you, will determine how much of that cleanup you have to do manually and how much you can automate and make easier. So let's hit the next one here. We often hear this one as well, which is kind of the other end of the spectrum. And that's people saying, my data, we're going to give some really clean and consistent data. By the way, all the speakers, like Sabina, they all just chuckled because they've heard this same thing themselves. And guess how would you respond, Naveh?
Yeah, we hear that a lot, and we find out that it's not. And again, because of all the projects that we did, we know what to look for. But for people who maybe not as experienced with conversion, they may look at the data and may think that the data is very consistent and clean, and you really have to show them the inconsistency, for them to really understand and say, well, I didn't even think about it. But something as simple, and I already covered it with figure references. It's something that people don't think, but if how do you reference to a figure? How do you know you went to the right figure? How do you deal with a table that span over multiple pages? How do you deal with step versus lists? They visually look the same and it looks very consistent, but how do you distinguish between the two? Hierarchy of paragraphs. Definitely inconsistent styling. We're seeing a lot of time, you look at it, it looks like a title, but in reality, it's not. It's a bold text. So the problem with the people that claim, that make that claim and attempt to do the conversion is they realize it only after they're deep into the conversion. And the goal of planning, the goal of the analysis up front is to find these variations before you start investing all the time in conversion and cleanup and viewing and integrating into a CMS and a publishing tool. But again, proper analysis up front will find most of these issues.
Well, another one we get sometimes is somebody will bring us something where they've already done a little bit of the work on the front end, and they say, hey, listen, it validates, it must be good, right? And I have to admit, this was kind of near and dear to my heart. When I was first starting out in XML, I went to a meeting with kind of a mentor of mine, Bill Castor, and we had a meeting with this guy, and they were already using XML, but he was really interested in working with Bill. And I came back and I said, Bill, I don't understand. I mean, this guy's already got XML. It seems like it's valid. What's going on? And he said, David, an important lesson is just because it's valid doesn't mean it's useful. And I thought, that's insightful. And so talk a little bit about how you would respond to this.
Yeah, I mean, XML that validates only guarantees that you are fulfilling the rules that are defined in the DTD or schema. That's the only thing that it basically says. If a schema tells you that inside a a task, you're only allowed to have a title, a paragraph, that's fine, in a specific order. That's the only thing that the validated files tell you. A validated files is not going to tell you if you tagged a step, let's say a proper step when it's really supposed to be a sequential list, or that you're linking to the correct location. The only thing it's going to tell you is that you link to somewhere that does have that ID that you're linking to, but it's not going to tell you that you're linking to the right location. It's not going to give you whether you did the hierarchy of nested topic properly, or if you merged or spanned entries in a table properly. But
kind of like the Word PDF example we had, right? The PDF made a valid Word document, but it separated that table in a weird place and created two different tables.
Correct. And when you develop a QA plan at the beginning of the process, you need to take that into account. You need to list all the checks that you're going to do that are not covered by simply rules that are defined by the schema. You need to develop how you're going to look for references, how you're going to do step versus procedure versus a sequential list, checks that are not resolved by validating a file.
Well, this next comment is really similar to that last comment, and again makes me think of the PDF example we just talked about. The table looked right, and people will say to us, "Well, you know what? It looks good. It must be tagged correctly." How would you respond to that?
Yeah, so this is similar to what you said with because it validates it's clean, it's correct, or if it looks okay, it's right. So it's not. And I gave you an example before. What happens a lot of time if you're supposed to tag something as a title, but in the XML file you tag it as bold text. If you publish it, it may not show up in a table of contents if you create it, but you will visually look at it and say, oh, bold text, that's fine. If it has numbering, you may even hard code the numbering inside, so it looks okay, but it's not auto-generated. And I'll give you even an example that even if you leave it the way that it looks, it's still something that will be accepted by some people, but not by people that DITA is where they want to go. Let's say you have a two-column table, where one column is the step numbering and another column is the action or the steps themselves. Leaving it as a table is not incorrect, but in reality, it really should be a procedure or a task. And so when you look at it, you see a table, you see the data, it displays properly, no problem there, but it loses the meaning of really being a task. Now you look at it, it's just a table. It's not just the way that you tag stuff incorrectly, but it's still displaying properly. It's also that it really loses the meaning of what it's supposed to be. So visual, if you look at it, it's okay, that's great, but it's not always correct.
Let's change direction a little bit, and here's another common one we hear, which is, oh, you know what? I don't really need to be involved. That's why I got this full service model. Although I would just say, if you watched the earlier sessions, you saw how much time and energy Shannon put into this project ahead of time. How much time and energy Jonathan put into this project ahead of time, because it's important and it's critical. How would you respond to this? I don't need to be involved.
Well, I do actually understand why people say that. Not that I agree, but I'm saying I do understand the basic saying, why do I need to be involved? Or listen, I'm paying for you, so just do your job. But usually what I say is that you're the one that is going to sustain the data, the converted data. So you really should be involved, and understanding how the data migrated from the legacy format to DITA makes it a lot easier first to adopt DITA, but also to make sustainment sustainment of the new data and adapting it a lot easier. So don't see it as a punishment, but it's something that is really going to make your life a lot easier down the line. Going to save you money, going to save you time. It's going to make sustainment a lot easier.
Well, and then on the flip side of this one, I don't think we hear this one nearly as much, post-pandemic as we did before the pandemic. But there was this kind of idea of, if I manually tag it, I'll be fine, right? So I've got plenty of technical writers. I can get all of them to work. And if I just manually tag it, it'll save me, all the QA time that I need to do. So we don't really need to worry about this automation. What would you say to that?
That's really famous last word of people that usually end up with not so successful conversion projects. It is different if you have few pages to convert. I mean, that's something else. But when you're dealing with more than just few pages, tagging manually is always a problem. First of all, it's a time-consuming task. But the bigger problem is that it will lead to many, many inconsistencies. After hours of tagging, of manually tagging, I guarantee you're going to start making bad judgment. You're going to introduce inconsistency. If you're not the only one hand tagging, and you have few people do that, that's even more, because you have different people making different judgment calls. So it's obvious that that's not a good solution.
I was kind of like we hear about in copy and paste in the industry. A lot of people will say, "Oh no, we'd never do a copy and paste workflow." Incidentally, let me put in a plug. We're going to be doing a webinar on content reuse and copy and paste workflows here in a couple of weeks. So I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Chris is doing that. But yeah, it does at least all that crazy inconsistency, and it doesn't really save you any QA time. It actually increases it.
No, and you can copy and paste a reference, a cross-reference. You can copy a table in Word and paste it inside and make it, a beautiful cows table in DITA. It does require, forget about consistency, it does require a lot of time.
Yeah. Well, the last common misconception we have is actually one that I think Sabina mentioned earlier today, and one that we dealt with earlier this week talking to somebody. There's this idea, just get it to DITA and we'll fix it later. We'll just get it to DITA. We'll clean up later. We'll handle reuse later. And how would you respond to that?
Again, fix it later always translate to more money, more inconsistencies, and again, possibly appearing in one of the epic failure slides that you'll create in the future. But it's always, and it could be something as simple as you may think that it's simple as looking for a reference and fixing them manually, or fixing hierarchy of topics, or fixing table structure, or placement of notes, putting them in the right location. So it initially doesn't sound like a lot, but it adds up a lot. Even a simple example of 2,000 pages, which again, for some people it's a lot, but typically it's not a huge project. And let's say you say, well, it's only 5 minutes to clean it up. That's 10,000 minutes, which is roughly 200 hours, almost a month of working days that you sit down and fixing it. Definitely inconsistent, definitely introducing errors, definitely making judgment calls different when you start working versus 5 a.m. and 9 in the morning that you work. Definitely it's going to be inconsistent. And again, forget the time that it's going to take you. All those inconsistencies might not even allow you to publish later on when you try to publish it. I know at least I am, after 5 minutes of manually fixing XML file, I go crazy. So I can only imagine what happened after 200 hours. I'm sure it's not a beautiful sight.
And let me speak here to all of you who are thinking about leading this kind of project. This will kill your project because, again, as I mentioned before, getting the writers on board is difficult enough. And you add in that, oh yeah, by the way, you've got 167 hours worth of cleanup to do before we ever really start to take advantage of this. That's not going to do well for you. You need to minimize that cleanup as much as possible. And now to all of you CCMS vendors that are out there as well, or technology vendors that are here with us today, this will also kill your projects because nobody blames the content strategy. They blame that tool that they bought. That CCMS just doesn't work, or that authoring system just doesn't work. Look at all this cleanup we're having to do. So make sure that you set this up. Well, let's actually talk about the pieces of the plan here. I think it was Abe Lincoln who had the famous quote about, give me 6 hours to chop a tree and I'll spend 4 hours, sharpening the axe or whatever. That's really not a very good quote when we're talking about nailed it. So I went out and I found an interview with Chef Jacques, who's one of the main judges on Nailed It. And what he says is, when you bake, make a plan. Spend a couple of minutes thinking, okay, what's my first step, second step, third step? You need a plan. for anything that you do, you need the plan. So I think it's pretty important that that you get the plan in baking, as in putting together your conversion strategy. So as you're putting together this plan, obviously there's some things that you got to know ahead of time. There's some things you're going to need. There's some things you got to do. Talk to me about, well, let's start with the things that you must know.
Yeah. And again, this slide, we've been mentioning reuse. This slide is reused in every presentation that I've been doing. I think the past, I don't know how many years I've been at DCL. And again, it's something that without it, everything is going to fail. But it's really important to ask some initial questions, like, for example, who are the stakeholders? And that's something that a lot of people don't know, and also unaware of who's the real stakeholders, and they miss a lot of them. But really, anyone that is involved in the project is a stakeholder. It's the management. You need the buy-in to get, especially for budget and resources. It's your technical writers. You need them to sustain your data in XML and learn DITA. It's the CMS provider. It's many people. It's not just you and the conversion house, or you and the tool provider. All the stakeholders have to be on the same page, and if they are, things will run a lot smoother. Knowing your budget, it will obviously affect the way that you develop your process. Depending on your budget, you may need to rely more on automation. You have to pick and choose what kind of functionalities you will have. Are you going to vectorize all your images or leave them as raster? How much are you going to spend on training the tech writers or whoever's going to sustain the data? Developing a schedule is something that people always, for some reason, see it as a challenge, but really, before developing the schedule, you need to take into account things that usually don't even think about at the beginning of the project. Like milestone of the revision cycles, the company shutdowns, milestone on ongoing project. Knowing all these milestones will help you plan accordingly and come up with a reasonable schedule. And it's also very important, obviously, to know what kind of CMS and publishing tools. In theory, if you go to DITA, it should work in everything, but especially with customized data, that's not always the case. So you need to get those answers, all those questions answered before you go to the next step.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And I think, anybody who's watching this, if you go back and watch Shannon's presentation, she talks a little bit about this, Jonathan's presentation. And I think it's also a good thing to just encourage you, if you're not working with a consultant, find a company like Ariza and reach out to them, because a lot of times they can really help you to start figuring out the answers to some of these questions and help set you on that right path. All right, let's move on to the things that you need, not just the things you must know. What about these things that you need?
Well, you definitely need either all the legacy data that you're going to convert, or as much as possible. The more data that you analyze up front, it makes sense that you're going to have less issues down the line. So, what happens with a lot of projects, and I gave you an example in the initial one, they selected a representative cross, take a maintenance document, user manual, all that kind of stuff, and converted them. And on paper, that's fine, but it was only 1% of the entire data. So you do need to take all the data, at least analyze all the data. It doesn't mean that you have to convert everything, but analyze as much legacy data as possible. And you also need to build a solid team. You don't need to be the expert in DITA, but you need to know enough to make logical decisions during the analysis, or when you're making a decision about what tools to use and all that kind of stuff. And when you talk to a professional, at least understand what they're telling you. So you do need to know DITA. You don't need to be an expert in DITA, but it's an important thing to know.
Yeah. And let me just add here, I think an important thing when you're looking at your legacy content, like you mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't have to be an all or nothing kind of a thing. I know some people will talk to a CCMS provider, and that CCMS provider says, listen, let's not worry about your legacy content. That's a lot of stress. Let's just get you started day forward. Let's get you, just as little as possible put into the system. And maybe for an initial implementation, there's some wisdom to that, but you need to think about the bigger picture here, that if you've got continuing content, if you've got content that needs to be reused, how frustrating for a writer to jump in and think, okay, I'm going to start reusing content and then not be able to find any of those modules to reuse. So it can be a measured approach. Maybe you start by just, we're going to convert this in this phase, and then we're going to expand and we're going to convert this in another phase. DCL does things in phases all the time, and I think it's a really solid approach and a smart approach. But again, it starts by looking across all your content and saying, what's the value here? This content from 1974 that's, a scanned PDF, do I really need to move that to DITA? For some people, it would be yes. For some people, it would be no. And just really start to think about, what's the value? How important is it? How do we want to prioritize it? And I think that's probably going to be something you're going to talk about here in things to do. So let's go ahead and let's move on to that and let you talk through this as well.
So there's obviously a few things that you need to do. One of them, which is very important, is plan a QA process and a plan.
Scott has welcomed us on our presentation. I don't know if you meant to share your screen, your camera there, Scott.
You're more than welcome to join. I was afraid that my kids are going to come in. I have 4 crazy kids running upstairs like a herd of elephants. I was afraid they're going to come in, and but yeah, the beauty of yeah. So I mean, some things to do. A QA plan and a QA process. That's really, you can spend a day just on that, and we just don't have the time to cover it. But have a plan to what really needs to be checked by automation, what require visual checking. You have to find that perfect balance between automation and manual review, and that's very critical. And again, that's a subject by itself. Agree on the conversion rules. So that's something that a lot of people, there's somebody that developed the rules, doesn't cover everything, and everybody trusts that everything is okay. You really need to involve the stakeholders in that, at least for them to see what the rules are. It gives them a great picture up front as how the data is going to be mapped before you get into full conversion. So it's not that you convert all the data and then somebody wakes up and said, I didn't want that. So you do need a walkthrough through the conversion and make sure everybody understands. Audit your legacy data. I covered that before, but depending on what legacy data you have, there's different things to check. If you're starting with a tag data or structured data, which is a huge misconception, a lot of people say, I start with XML, what's the problem? But you need to check validity of the legacy data, cross-references, graphic entity, table structure, tagging completeness, auto-generated text that I mentioned before. If you start with Word or like a FrameMaker, you need to check the data flow, also table structure, styling consistency. It's a big problem. Things may look like they were styled properly, but we know for a fact it's never the case. There's always some issues with styling consistency. And text boxes. People don't think about it, but it's a huge problem when people convert because they don't think about that. They convert the data, and text boxes really are stuff that flows on the data. And a lot of times, all those text boxes, if you don't think about it, they're lost. When you go to convert, or they float and appear somewhere else when you do the conversion. So you need to take that into account when you do an analysis on the legacy data. And PDF and paper, we already covered it a little bit before, but you do need to check the quality of the pages. As you mentioned, some pages are just maybe too of a poor quality that you're not going to convert. You need to spend some time planning your scanning and OCR process. You can't just scan the pages and treat a table as paragraphs. You need to zone and make sure that all the cells are done properly. You need to come up with a plan of how to style and check styling once you're done extracting the data, and normalizing the data. That's something that again also can be just a day of discussion. But there's a way to normalize your data even if it's all over the place, like we mentioned before. Content use analysis is critical, and it's obviously important because for the reason of finding redundancy, but there's other benefits. First, it increases the consistency of your data. It reduces development time because now you're dealing with less data and more organized data. And because you're dealing with more consistent data, there's less maintenance cost. I don't know how many with time, so I'll go quickly. I mean, the next 2 bullets are sort of aligned together. Preparing samples is just a very efficient way to test the rules that you develop. So before you get into production, showing the sample data, even if it's a hand tag sample, just to show the concept of the rules, that saves a lot of headaches later on, And also it brings all the people to the same page, all the stakeholders. You see tag data and you say, this is how your data is going to do. Same with pilot and really a limited production run. You run a cross section of the data just to make sure that it's implemented correctly, not just run everything through and find the issues later on. Yes, and I believe that's it.
Well, and just like we talked about with the things that you must know, a good consultant, like Brian, is worth his weight in gold, right? Because they can ask the right questions and help you through that. And I would say here in this things to do, a really good conversion vendor is worthwhile, because a good conversion vendor doesn't just take what you got and immediately spit something back out to you. Always beware of that kind of conversion vendor, or anybody who says, oh, that's easy. You want somebody who's going to say, we've got some tools that will help you to analyze your data. We've got something like Harmonizer that will help you figure out where the reuse is. We've got a process that says, let's agree on some conversion rules. We have a process that says, let's look for some areas that maybe we can automate the cleanup. Let's put together some automation around QA and a process that will flag things. So that kind of thing is really important, and it's not something you have to do on your own. Anyways, with obviously time running out, let's jump to this last slide here, and let's just talk about some of the benefits of planning. I mean, obviously, I see there's a real benefit here, because I think you get a lower total conversion cost when you work through a plan, because you're doing a lot less cleanup. You've got more time to make adjustments along the way, because you kind of plan for potential problems. You get a faster implementation, right? Because people can start actually using the tool because you've planned effectively, and they're not having to spend as much time doing cleanup. You're getting higher adoption rates because, again, they get to focus on writing. You're implementing content reuse, so you can actually start taking advantage of that on the front end. Somebody like Jonathan with Intralox, look, they did twice as many projects for what, a third of the cost, something like that, and a lot of that was around content reuse. Of course, you mentioned before automation, so you get more accurate results and easier and cheaper data sustainment. So if we've got any questions, let's pull those up, and then Naveh, I'll let you finish up here and tell us now that we've nailed it and gotten our plan together. Talk a little bit more about these benefits.
Okay. So there's no questions, or?
We do not have any questions coming in yet. I do invite anyone who's here. You've got these two great consultants and DITA experts. Ask away, and we'll give folks a minute to see. But I'm conscious of everyone's time too, so I want to keep our schedule going. While I personally love this conversation, DITA and structured content, it would be really fun, Naveh, if your kids interrupted and ran in the background.
And you happen to love baking too, as I recall.
I'm locked in the basement. The door is locked with keys. I don't know if they can break that one, but
okay. Well, we are going to switch into our next panel session. Thank you both so much. That was really fun, and I hope everyone who's watching gets to nail it.